Hi everyone, welcome to HST 3103, America in Crisis, 1929 to 1945. And today we will be talking about women, work, and World War II. World War II provided one of the most significant shifts in labor patterns in American history, with millions of women entering the workforce and or taking on jobs that had been traditionally held by men, especially jobs that had been traditionally associated with masculine qualities and characteristics in terms of how gender roles and gender was configured in American culture. So this week we'll look at the kinds of work women were doing during the war, push against some misconceptions about working women during World War II, and hear about the experiences of women working for the war economy, and also throughout the whole lecture today and discussion, examine the cultural effects of this time on conceptions of gender and gender roles in America. So just a little refresher of the things that we've touched on before when talking about gender and gender roles in this class. The 1940s and the World War II era presents both sort of change and stability for women in America, especially in terms of how conceptions of women and female roles and gender were changing. The 1920s, the jazz era, the age of the flapper, and the age of a figure we often call the new woman, and there are increasingly more women entering the workforce in the 20s, not as much as during World War II, but increasingly more women entering the workforce, and there's kind of this idea of more autonomy and more freedom and more room for individual expression in the culture for women. There's a lot of clash in the 20s, obviously, between these new cultural attitudes about women and older attitudes that still persist. The Great Depression is often seen as kind of a swing back to more traditional conceptions about gender, especially as you face a crisis of unemployment. Typically, then jobs are given priority to men. Of course, obviously, there's a lot of professions and occupations, even during the Great Depression, such as childcare, such as domestic work, secretarial work, that is seen as female. Secretarial work is something that's newer in terms of being seen as female, but definitely by the time of the 1930s, there's all of these occupations that are very feminized, and we'll see that into the 1940s as well. But the 30s are kind of a bit of a swing away from these newfound freedoms of the 1920s. And we tend to think of the World War II era as this massive expansion of women in the workplace and this opportunity perhaps for new conceptions about gender and gender roles. But as soon as the war ends, you do get a swing back to more traditional conceptions of gender and the role of woman more being in the house as opposed to the workplace. Now, on the ground, things have changed somewhat, but definitely the culture pushes against kind of the possibilities that World War II creates. And we'll look at kind of this back and forth between more openness and more conservativeness and a lot of the materials that you'll be examining for class today. American women in World War II became involved in a wide array of jobs and occupations. As the war involved massive conflict in theaters of war around the world, the population on the home front had to be mobilized to support the war machine. This made the expansion of the employment of women critical to the war effort, as many men who traditionally filled most of these jobs were drafted into the armed services. So women during the war entered professional areas of work that previously were the preserve of men. But in most cases, this was seen as a temporary necessity. However, did it change in any way American cultural attitudes towards working women? And this is something that we'll be coming back to in the discussion. 19 million American women worked jobs directly connected to the war effort on the home front during World War II. There had been an expansion of women into the workforce during World War I, but World War II was a significantly greater expansion, as U.S. involvement in the war, World War II was much greater than World War I, and the scale of World War II was much more massive. So the demand was a lot higher. both for soldiers on the field and for people to fill the spaces back home that were left behind by the soldiers going on the field, as well as just the economy itself expanding, and the number of jobs that were available to support the war effort were expanding as well. Women worked in a variety of fields on the home front to support the U.S. war economy. They worked directly in the war industries, building ships, aircraft, vehicles, weapons, and ammunition for the U.S. military. They worked in factories and plants, taking over the manufacturing and assembly line job that men mainly worked before the war. Of course, we associate this with the iconic Rosie the Riveter image that displays a woman in this kind of work, and we'll discuss this image later in the lecture today, and we'll be looking at images of it for one of our cases this week. Women worked on farms and other kinds of agricultural labor, obviously before the war, but during the war in great numbers. They took over office jobs and white-collar jobs from men, especially lower level, and continued to fill secretarial and support staff positions that women had increasingly been filling in the previous decades of the 20th century. As the size of the federal government expanded dramatically with the war, almost 1 million women started working for the U.S. government, many of them in Washington, D.C. So you actually have, hundreds of thousands of mostly young single women moving to Washington, D.C. in the early 1940s to fill all of these jobs. These women were referred to at the time as, quote, government girls, which obviously has a pretty sexist connotation now. But it was a jumping off place for a lot of women to have a career in the federal government. And a lot of these women who worked in Washington, D.C. Held very important positions. For example, women served in the Office of Strategic Studies, the U.S. Intelligence Agency during World War II, the precursor to the CIA, and women made up about 4,500 of the 13,000 employees of the OSS. And some of these jobs, of course, were clerical, but women served as operations agents, as code breakers, as undercover agents. Very, just sort of as a side story, very anecdotally, my great-great-aunt Louise from Chickasha, Oklahoma, left Oklahoma and worked for the OSS in Washington, D.C. during World War II and stayed in Washington as a government employee for the rest of her working life. And back in Chickasha, Oklahoma, because when she would come back and visit, she had fancy cars, fancy clothes, and was single her entire life. Everybody didn't believe her cover story that she was working for a government, or everybody thought that it was a cover story that she was working for a government agency. They all thought that she was a sex worker. So, it tells you a lot about attitudes in regards to gender and labor at the time. So some women continued to engage in labor viewed as more traditionally, quote, female, like sewing, cleaning, cooking, but in support roles that directly aided the war. For example, sewing upholstery for military vehicles instead of being on the assembly line plant, pounding nails on the into the military vehicle. And even women not officially employed volunteered their time in tremendous numbers with organizations like the Red Cross, engaging in activities like planting victory gardens, selling war bonds, and sending care packages to soldiers. In addition to those 19 million women on the home front, 400,000 women enlisted in the U.S. military during World War II, many serving as nurses on the front lines and others in auxiliary units. So the Women's Air Force Service Pilots, the Women's Army Corps, the U.S. Navy Women's Reserve, and the Marine Corps Women's Reserve were the main women's auxiliary organizations to the U.S. military during the war. We'll look at some material in class, and I'll talk about them a little bit more in a minute, related to the WASPs, the Women's Air Force Service Pilot. Also, they've kind of colloquially become known as the, quote, fly girls for one of the cases this week, and hear about some of their experience being female pilots in the military during World War II. Many of the 19 million women, though, who are working in jobs on the home front, many of them before World War II, and this is kind of a misconception that, that 19 million women all of a sudden entered the workforce who had never been in the workforce before. Actually, a good number of those women were already working or had been working. Perhaps they were working outside of the official economy, doing what we would call today like the gig economy, or they were working lower paying jobs before World War II started, or in some cases too, were returning to the workforce after being laid off during the Great Depression, now that more jobs were available, and especially jobs being available for women. It's actually been estimated that of those 19 million women that were working on the home front, that only 3 million of them were brand new female workers who had never been in the economy before by the time of the war. And of course, let's not forget that probably almost all of them are engaged in unpaid housework and childcare, which is still work, hard work. Many women took on jobs that were dominated before the war by men, for example, factory work. But one of the kind of tensions of women taking on these jobs is that there's this expectation that this is temporary, that things would go back to quote normal, that they would return to their more domestic roles after the war is over. One of the things that we'll be looking at is a series for class this week is a series of propaganda posters about how the government specifically targeted women and their roles as workers and participants in the war economy, and looking at the different sort of how conceptions of gender and gender roles are both changing, but also kind of the same in terms of these recruitment efforts. And women who worked outside the home, of course, still had to do what we now call the second shift of unpaid housework and childcare duties in the home. It should be noted that many of the women who took jobs during World War II were mothers, and these women with children at home, and especially if they had a partner who was away at war, many women with children at home who were working in the war economy would pool their efforts together to raise families. They assembled in groups and shared chores such as cooking, cleaning, washing clothes. Many women who were engaged in these cooperatives had young children, and they shared apartments and houses so they could save time, money, utilities, share food. And if all of the women involved in these cooperative arrangements worked, they worked different shifts so that they could take turn babysitting. So there's a lot of, as in non-wartime economy, there's a lot of invisible labor by women going on behind the scenes. And in this case, during World War II, supporting other women with unpaid household and childcare labor that was essential to the war economy because it allowed the women going to work to actually go to those factory jobs and other jobs. One thing the assigned reading this week does a really good job at, and I think we'll sort of touch on throughout some of the cases that we look at, is sort of how experiences with work differed according to race and ethnicity and class among women during World War II. I mean, lower class women, and especially women of color, were already part of the labor force in high numbers, right? Poor women, working class women have always worked in the American economy out of economic necessity. So World War II was a mixed bag in terms of opportunities, especially for minority women. For example, black women were often the last to be hired and the first to be fired in some of these coveted factory jobs. And of course, they faced discrimination and segregation in the workforce from their bosses and white female and male co-workers. But on the other hand, the great migration of African Americans is going on at this time, as droves of African Americans leave the rural South to urban areas in the West and North, which gave African American women access to more job opportunities than the sharecropping and domestic labor that was open to them in the South. And the story that you guys will listen to of Betty Soskin, who I'll talk about later in this lecture a little bit more, in the Rosie's case, highlights, I think, these opportunities for economic advancement, but also discrimination that African American women uniquely faced during World War II. So by 1945, when victory seemed assured for the United States, government-sponsored propaganda was definitely urging women to go back to working in the home, especially as soldiers start returning. And about 75% of the women who entered the labor force during World War II left after the war was over. So while there is this drop in women's participation in the labor force, it's still higher than it was before the war. For example, the overall percentage of women working in factories fell from 36% during the war to 28% in 1947, 2 years after the war. So that's a fairly significant drop, but still in 1947, for 28% of all factory workers to be women, it's probably a lot higher than many people would think it would be in that era. So while mainstream American culture is producing a narrative about return to the traditional family roles, return to, quote, normal after World War II, on the ground, many women continue to work out of necessity for many, as it always has been, but also for some women because they now see a career as an important part of who they are, and they continue with their career after the war. So the reading goes into a lot of detail about some of the cultural effects of women in work during World War II. I'm not going to talk about that too much here, but I want us to think about it as we look at all of the different cases. The reading assignment talks a lot about the ambivalence created in American culture through the challenges that women working in the workforce and women in military uniform made to traditional conceptions of gender and gender roles. So think about some of those ambivalences that are running through the thread of all of the materials we look at for this week. Now, of course, by the end of the war and by the late 1940s, there's definitely this larger cultural story about returning to these traditional roles. And certainly when we think of the late 1940s and 1950s American culture, we definitely view it as a swing back to a much more conservative culture in regards to women and gender roles. And part of this pushback, a significant part of this pushback is, again, because of the presence of so many women in the workforce during World War II, often engaging in work and activities that had been deemed, quote, masculine, and the threat that this would pose to the patriarchal order and to traditional conceptions of gender and gender roles upon which that patriarchal order was based. But, World War II, you do see this swing back, but the door's open. The door's open. And it's an important, even though there's kind of this return to some conservativeness, there's still a lot of women who stay in the workplace, and there is kind of an undercurrent of some of those cultural attitudes changing, which we'll see sort of the fruition of a few decades later in American history. So there's three particular sets of materials, three cases that you guys are going to look at for this week. The first is images of women and gender roles in military propaganda. So I've uploaded 4 images that are, each image is a set of posters that kind of converge on a common theme. Usually when I do this class live, and in person, I guess I should say, I break everybody up into small groups and I give each group a set of images. But you're just going to have to look at them on your own, and then during the live class discussion Wednesday at 5 o'clock, I can actually pull up some of those images and we can talk about them. But U.S. government propaganda posters help recruit women both to the home front war effort as well as to convince them to serve in the armed forces. So when you look at these images, think about how the posters draw on different conceptions of gender and gender roles, what it means to be a woman, conceptions of femininity, ideas about gender and work, gender and family, and think about how traditional conceptions of these ideas are being reinforced, how they're being subverted, and sometimes how the same poster is doing both at the same time. And then I've provided a link to a short Air Force recruiting video called 2015 called I Am an American Airman, which is recruiting women into the U.S. Air Force. I want you to watch that and maybe come up with some comparisons and contrasts to the way that women were being recruited in the World War II posters. What's similar and what's different? So the second set of materials that you'll be looking at is related to the iconic image of Rosie the Riveter, who is one of the most iconic images from World War II and probably 20th century American popular culture. Rosie the Riveter represents the American women who worked in factories during World War II, many of whom produced munitions for the war. And even today, Rosie continues to be used as an icon of feminism, and you see the image reworked over and over again for different kinds of purposes. So, what can the various ways the image and idea of Rosie the Riveter was being deployed during World War II tell us about conceptions of gender and work at this time? How are these conceptions both changing and then staying the same? And what do the differences between the different images of Rosie that you're going to look at tell us about some of the tensions at the time during this era? So there's one image that I've put up that has three images on it. The first is the cover of the Rosie the Riveter song sheet music. The second is the famous We Can Do It poster by J. Howard Miller that was made as an inspirational image to boost worker morale, female worker morale in 1942 at a Westinghouse plant. And then the third is Norman Rockwell's Saturday Evening Post magazine cover of Rosie the Riveter. So there's a link to one image that has all three of these on here. Next, I want you to listen to the Rosie the Riveter song and read the lyrics. So there's a link to a YouTube video that both plays the song and then shows you the lyrics. And the term Rosie the Riveter was actually first used in this 1942 song written by Red Evans and John Jacob Loeb. The song was recorded by numerous artists throughout the World War II era, including the popular big band leader Kay Kaiser, which that version became a national hit. And then finally, in regards to Rosie's, I want you to listen to the story of Betty Reed Soskin in the segment Rosie Covered Glasses from the Backstory podcast episode on women at work, and there's a link to it. So Betty is currently, right now, I think she's 98 now, the oldest national park ranger in the U.S. and works at the Rosie the Riveter World War II Homefront National Historical Park in Richmond, California. And her experiences as an African-American woman working during World War II for a black union speak to the intersection of race and class in working experiences of women during World War II, also to the diversity of the black experience because her family came from Louisiana and she's also of Creole and Cajun origins. And also I think her story complicates the narrative that we have about Rosies, about women who are working in factories and working sort of in industrial production during World War II. And then the final set of cases is about the WASPs, the Women's Air Force Service Pilots, which was one of these auxiliary armed forces units. During World War II, as I mentioned before, approximately 400,000 women served in the U.S. Armed Forces. A lot of the jobs that they performed were nurses, secretarial positions, clerical work, and support jobs, because women could not obviously work in combat role for a variety of clearly misogynistic reasons, and that actually didn't change until 2016 in the U.S. military. So women worked in these auxiliary units. These auxiliary units became officially recognized as a permanent part of the U.S. Armed Forces after the war in 1948. So you're looking at materials related to the WASPs, the Women's Air Force Service Pilots, who were female pilots who transported aircraft, flew training missions, and other non-combat roles during World War II. There were over 1,000 trained WASP pilots who flew from 126 bases in the United States and carried 50% of the combat aircraft during the war. So when combat aircraft essentially had to be transported from one base to another, that was one of their main jobs. And 38 of these women died in service, mostly in training accidents. So you're going to watch a 1943 video by the U.S. government on WASPs. The link is called Welcome to the Good Old Days. You're going to watch a Arizona Highways, which is a local Arizona educational show, a segment they did on the Fly Girls. And then you're going to watch and listen to excerpts from an oral history interview of WASP Mildred Darlene Tuttle Axton, who actually is from Kansas. And when you listen to all of these stories and watch all this material, I want you to compare and contrast how the US government was presenting WASPs in 1943 to how we present their history now, and how WASPs present their own individual history in current times. There is a primary source assignment for this week, which deals with larger issues of not necessarily gender, but actually sexuality in the war, asking you to compare and contrast documents about the official view of the US government towards LGBTQ plus service people, and compare and contrast that with personal accounts of LGBTQ plus veterans who served in World War II. And there's some fascinating primary sources, both about official government policy as well as some excellent personal accounts and oral history by veterans themselves who are queer and their experiences in World War II. And it's an interesting contrast. So that is it for Women and Work in World War II lecture, and I will hopefully see all of you guys at 5 o'clock on Wednesday for the live Zoom discussion, or if you can't make it to that, then I'll be interacting with you on the discussion board, and the assignment is due by the end of the day on Sunday. See you soon.